probably a little humor in doing Ecclesiastes last in a class like this, that we come to the book at the end that tells us that everything else that we've done this whole time is completely and utterly meaningless. So probably a good thing that we saved this one for last. Ecclesiastes, which is the Greek title of the book, just means church document. The Hebrew title is Qoheleth, which is the author of the text. The author is sort of shrouded in mystery. The word Qoheleth itself just means one who assembles, gathering people together. Usually it is a word for translated preacher. I don't like the word preacher for translation because we have so much baggage with that term. Teacher probably is a little more innocuous and might be a better translation of the word Qoheleth. The author identifies himself as the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now we happen to know a son of David who is king in Jerusalem. We called him Solomon, and for that reason tradition has always associated this book with Solomon, one of the three canonical books that are associated with Solomon. But the language clearly reflects a later date. So it is written down much, much later than Solomon, probably post-exilically even. It is a text that might reflect an earlier tradition, so maybe it was just written down later and preserved orally for a long time, or it was composed a little bit later. I mean, the truth is anybody who was on the throne in Judah would have called themselves a son of David, king in Jerusalem. So any of those individuals could easily have be attributed for authorship, or it could be written in the name of someone else. That kind of writing was pretty common, particularly in the intertestamental period. The book is full of melancholy skepticism, but it is canonical, so we've got to wrestle with what that means. I mean, this book is part of the biblical text. We can't just throw it out, and it's kind of difficult sometimes. This book is incredibly cynical. It is cynical about tradition and authority, and it would even challenge the authority of God in some ways. I mean, the author believes in God, but does not believe that any of God's ways can be known through experience. So that kind of revelation that we see, that indirect revelation that we see in Proverbs, that is sort of the basis of Proverbs, the belief that God made this world to follow certain rules, and that by looking at this world you can learn a little bit about the kind of world that God wanted and what it needs to be. Ecclesiastes says, no, you really can't. Looking at this world doesn't tell you anything about that. And the reality is, living in this world is, in some ways, a meaningless act. In fact, look at the beginning of Ecclesiastes, or Qoheleth. Supremely meaningless, says the teacher, supremely meaningless, all is meaningless. What do people gain from all the troublesome work at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Everything is meaningless, completely and totally meaningless, or vanity, as the King James likes to translate it. Emptiness. Hebel is a word that's associated with vapor or wind, or just a nothing, just blows away. This world has no enduring purpose whatsoever. Now, this book, the theological contribution of this book, it's interesting because it's sort of divided into two camps, where there are some who see this book as having a decidedly negative contribution to the text, that basically this book represents a growing skepticism with an accepted religious tradition. Gerhard von Rad was the one who said that you had this sort of Deuteronomic theology taking over, that retributive justice, and Ecclesiastes just comes along and says, nuh-uh, that's basically the purpose. It's just not true. Don't believe that. There's no contribution there whatsoever. The world doesn't work that way. There are others who thinks this is a little more constructive. There's a little more positive contribution. Zimmerli thought this book was not just saying nuh-uh to that bad theology, or that limited theology of retributive justice, but is actually going a step further and saying it's a corrective to that poor application of wisdom, and actually arguing for how a person should live, not just against believing in this one thing, but actually offering a constructive purpose. Well, one of the things that attacks is finding meaning in the things we typically find meaning in. In fact, there's nothing that is sacrosanct here in Ecclesiastes. He'll attack anything. Death is the great equalizer. It negates any advantage human beings have over animals. In fact, it believes that we all die at that point. Fame, wealth, wisdom, work, righteousness, all of those things pass away at death. That there is no ultimate goal at that point. Death becomes the ultimate equalizer. So there is no sense of any hope after death. So we don't have any idea of heaven for the author of Ecclesiastes. That's an idea that comes much later in history. For him, it seems death is the end of everything. And so wisdom's not going to provide meaning, fame, wealth, none of those things provides meaning. Now, there is something that actually does seem to provide some meaning, and that is enjoyment. That taking joy in the simple pleasures and basics of human existence, taking joy in work, taking joy in eating, taking joy in drinking, taking joy in sort of these basic things, that can provide some ultimate meaning, but not the kind of ultimate. You're not going to get any sort of enduring, fame, wealth, wisdom things. So wisdom is not the end all be all that people would think it was. So it's really interesting to have a wisdom text that uses wisdom language, talk about the limitations of wisdom. But he keeps pursuing wisdom. Even though he knows wisdom is limited, he keeps pursuing wisdom. And at the end of the day, wisdom and fearing God seem to be the best options, and we'll talk about what that means at the end. But I want to offer one positive contribution to this book at this point. I mean, there is a positive side to the skepticism, and that is, I think, the simple formulas can't contain God. You remember the God of Job's friends is a God that worked in simple formulas, right? That you put in a nickel's worth of obedience, you get back a nickel's worth of blessing. If you put $1 worth of obedience, you get back $1 worth of blessing. I mean, it was a giant vending machine God who was waiting for you to be obedient so that he could bless you to the degree of your obedience. You could actually control God in that way. That if you're obedient, then God will respond in certain controllable ways. And Ecclesiastes comes along and says, no, that God is way too small. That God is not worth following. That the complete nature of God is unknown and unknowable from our perspective. We don't have the ability to try to gain insight. That's how big God is. Basically, Ecclesiastes reminds us to be realists. Qoheleth is coming along and telling us the things that I think we know. I think we sort of hope that Deuteronomic theology is right. We sort of hope we're going to be rewarded for doing good things. But I think we also know that that's not the way the world works, and that pleasure and success are not necessarily signs of deep righteousness and obedience, and sorrow and hard times are not necessarily signs of sin, which is actually a good thing, because think about it. If you live in this world with this theological idea that if bad things are happening to you, it's because of sin, then anytime something bad happens to you, you can't be present with God. God can't abide in the presence of sin, and clearly you're in your state because you're sinful. That's why bad things happen. So God can't even be there. Ecclesiastes God, though, a God who works beyond those categories, doesn't work in those limited vending machine categories. Qoheleth's God is so sovereign that he can be present in every time of life. In every time of life, in joy, in sorrow, in dancing, in difficulty, whatever it is, everything in life is important, and God can be present in everything. So it truly is, I think, a beautiful picture. When you make God that much bigger, now all of a sudden he can be present in those difficult times. And you don't ever have to utter the phrase, "What have I done to deserve this?" because the world doesn't necessarily work according to the "What have I done to deserve this" category. The book ends in this way. Verse 11 of chapter 12 says, "The sayings of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd." So I suppose on one level we should be encouraged that Ecclesiastes has done what it was supposed to be. Right? It's supposed to goad us. It's supposed to poke at us. It's supposed to unsettle us and move us in direction. So if you have read Ecclesiastes and are troubled by it and are moving, then I suppose that we can say this is a saying of the wise, because it has goaded you as you were reading it. Verse 12, "Of anything beyond these, my child, beware. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh." Probably didn't need to tell students that. "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." Now, this ending has actually been criticized for years. Folks have felt that this doesn't have the same tone. This notion of fearing God, providing some sense of duty or purpose, doesn't seem to fit with the rest of the meaningless, utterly meaningless. And I don't have any problems thinking that this might be added later, because, that's the way documents worked as they were shaped by communities over time, and I certainly believe God was at work in that. But I also don't think that this ending is so out of bounds from the rest of the text. Because what he doesn't say in this ending doesn't say fear God because that's the way to get blessing. He doesn't say fear God because that gives you some control over it. Fear God because that keeps you from having sorrow or suffering. Fear God because it gives you ultimate purpose. No, it says fear God because that's the duty of everyone. Fear God because it's what you're supposed to do. So I think there is a sense in which at the end of the day that there is this message that almost mirrors Job's disinterested piety. Fear God. Why? Because he's God, and that's what you need to do. Don't think it gives you any sense of control. Don't think it gives you any sense of necessarily extra blessing because you've done more than someone else. Don't think it gives you any special understanding in life. But remember to place God, remember the positions here. Fear God because God is God and you aren't God. Do what God says because that's what you need to do. Not because there is any sense of a weight or evaluation in that. So a very interesting book that struggled to make it into the canon for obvious reasons. That decided negativity and skepticism probably gave it a hard time trying to become canonical, but it finally made it, and as a result has a great deal to teach us, I think, particularly about how big God truly is.